of the eternal debates that all EDH players face when making deck building decisions is Synergies or Staples. Does a card's mechanical or thematic relevance outweigh its efficiency when compared to the format's most powerful spells? And ultimately, does it even matter? Welcome to Magic the Flavouring, the Magic the Gathering podcast where we talk about all things Magic, flavour design and lore. I am your host, Andy Mann.
Hello, this is Nathan Cancel.
And today we are going to be talking about Synergies versus Staples in deck building. So we've been quite lore heavy over the past few months. I think that's kind of the groove that we've fallen into, is looking at the kind of heavy flavour of cards and the lore. Obviously flavour's in our name, but something that I think we've always tried to do in one or two episodes, and it was certainly something that we wanted to talk about more when we first started the podcast, Nathan, is the kind of mechanical themes and mechanical flavour of cards and decks as much as how much lore is being packed into them, right?
Yeah, well, it's the scale of are you a Vorthos or a Melvin, right? Like,
Yeah.
And I think mechanical flavor is really important as well as like lore flavor and an artistic flavor, because I think that's really kind of how a card functions and how it feels as you play it actually probably has more to do with what the card is doing rather than what the card is represented by, right? Sometimes maybe that nuance can get lost a little bit when you're kind of like building and when you see the same cards in pre-cons, and that's an interesting one because I think that's a good flavor point for later we'll talk about, because maybe pre-cons aren't doing that anymore. But yeah, you're seeing the same cards and like play throughout like history, I guess, of the format. There are some that have stuck around and then there are others that seem to be much more flexible. So
today we're going to be talking about Synergies versus Staples. It's kind of a question that I think all players kind of pick up on, and it's certainly since EDH has become sort of the format of choice for the majority of Magic players as well, because you can have this kind of breadth and creativity in your deck building. The argument between, do you just put the same sort of 100 cards that EDH rec tell you are the most played cards in your deck because you know they work well, or do you try and branch out, or do you fit to a theme, or whatever the hell you want to do? This isn't necessarily a problem for a lot of other formats, although I know some people like building rogue decks or theme decks, like especially if they're tribal, for example. But this just seems to be a question that you and I have been having for a lot, like recently, just in our sort of private conversations about Magic, because we don't record every conversation we have about Magic because it would be 30 hours a week at least.
No, but somebody does.
Somebody does. Jesus. But I've also noticed other people talking about it as well. It just seems to be just in the mindset of people at the moment of where the game's going in terms of, seeing the same cards over and over again. And I think a little bit to do with it is the fact that because we're getting so much new product and because we are only staying on one set per plane these days, the kind of ramping of different types of cards, of different flavor of cards, new mechanics, reprints, old spins on old cards, or like new versions of like old cards and all this kind of stuff, is just making the game so diverse at such a rate. Whereas, say, 3 or 4 years ago, you would have standard sets that would last maybe 2 sets or 3 set blocks. So it'd be like a half a year for like maybe 1 or 2 mechanics to kind of work its way out. And then you get the odd commander deck that would kind of help it out as well. But now it's so ramped up. So we're going to be talking about it today. We're going to be looking at it kind of in like a flavor sense still. Like, this isn't going to be a complete gameplay episode because we are still a flavor podcast. And I think, for me at least, I don't know about you, Nathan, when I'm talking about Synergies versus Staples, the word Synergies in the context of this episode will still mean like flavorful, because you can have a deck that's super flavorful, like a theme deck, but none of it synergizes. Like if you build like a Weatherlight deck or like a Phyrexian Praetors deck, none of the cards are going to synergize with each other in an EDH deck, even if they're all like on theme with each other. But I think for the purposes of this conversation, when we're talking about Synergies, I'm at least going to be talking about like if they thematically fit with each other or mechanically fit with each other, like they'll sit in the same category versus the staple cards that we're talking about. Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think the idea is that staples inherently aren't synergistic. They are like typically they serve a function more than having like allowing other cards to serve a function through them. It's almost like they sit independently. Like, I think it's a very good jumping off point to talk about in terms of like certain effects aren't replicatable. Certain cards need to do a certain thing, and it's maybe better, especially in terms of efficiency. The more competitive you're playing, the more likely you are to go with the best option. Like we talked about this when we were looking at flavor alternatives for the top 20 staples of the format. And it was kind of hard to come away from certain cards, like say Cultivate or Kadama's Reach is really good examples of cards that just do a certain thing that other cards, we've seen a breadth of other flavorful options that do it, but they are quote unquote worse, and depending on how competitive you feel, or how much you need the deck to function succinctly, like those will be your options. Whereas maybe sometimes there are better options out there that play to a specific theme. But if you're playing super competitively, it's usually because you're pushing towards a combo, or maybe you're going like Voltron, or even like thematically Voltron. Like if you're playing a Tulane deck, it's not you're loading Tulane up with loads of enchantments and equipments and attacking with him, but every one of your cards in your deck funnels through that ability, right? So you don't want the bells and the whistles. You need it to have the smallest amount of text possible to serve the function. So I think these days the amount of words on cards, I think we've gone from back in the day when you had really old cards that were like overly complicated for no reason. I felt like there was a point in the middle where they tried to cut down, and I think this is an inhalation exhalation thing with Magic, of where sometimes it feels like the game needs to simplify itself, and then sometimes we get mechanics like mutate. So it's one of these things. I think that because, as you say, we have such an influx of different mechanics, different themes, different play styles coming into the game each year, and we don't settle on, say, landfall for 3 sets in a row. You tend to have so many more words on the cards that do so many more nuanced things that might not be. And this is going to be an interesting question in 2 years' time. Are these really verbose cards going to become staples because they do a thing that's really, really succinctly, well, not succinctly, but something that's very powerful and nothing else does it like that? Or are they still going to fall to the wayside in favor of cards that have much smaller amount of text and just do a simpler thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a good like little microcosm for my approach to it is if you take a card like Counterspell, which is blue counter target spell. Classic staple counterspell card. It is the counterspell, right? And then you take another card like Stoic Rebuttal, which is one colorless blue counter target spell, but it has Metalcraft that says Metalcraft Stoic Rebuttal costs 1 less to cast if you control 3 or more artifacts. So if you're in an artifacts deck, it becomes a counterspell. When I ran my Brutaclad deck, which I took apart, but only recently, so it's still fairly fresh in my mind, I ran Stoic Rebuttal over counterspell because I wanted something that still functioned the same, but was synergistically and flavorfully on point for the rest of the deck, right? But if I was really adhering to the staple idea, it's objectively a worse card than Counterspell, because if I don't have those 3 artifacts, I've got a Counterspell that costs 1 more. Do you know what I mean? At no point in the game is a Stoic Rebuttal better than a Counterspell.
Sure. I guess the argument might be that if you're playing around Spell Snare, right, that only counters the spell that has convert mana cost 2. Maybe something like the corner case.
That's so niche.
I know. Well, I
just come up with the most niche example.
I know. Well, this is the thing, right? Because strictly better isn't. You can't do that, like, because there's always a counter argument. But I have the same thing with Wizard's Retort. I have played Wizard's Retort over Counterspell and Will and Rowan, which has a Wizard sub theme. Recently, I cut the Wizard sub theme out of it, so I had to cut Wizard's Retort out of it because it was a synergistic counterspell rather than being a staple counterspell. I couldn't just leave it in because it's inherently worse than a counterspell because it doesn't have the typical flavor upside that the deck's looking for. So that's very much a good example of, like, yes, I was playing an arguably worse version because it flavorfully fit the deck. And then once you cut that flavor out of the deck, then that card has to go with it, and it was only in there because of its quote unquote synergy.
Yeah. Well, I guess then, like, let's talk about like our sort of own experience then, because that's kind of really, this is really what this episode is. This is us recording a conversation that we've been having for like quite a lot recently. If we were to look at our own EDH decks, and what I'll do for listeners is I'll put in the Linktree link to our Linktree, as that's what it is. And on our Linktree, we've got links to our deck lists of all our EDH decks. So if you want to look at our deck lists and scoff at them or whatever, or if you just want to follow along as we're talking about sort of certain choices that we made in some of our decks, I will leave it there. But we've often said on this podcast, and we've said on social media and whatever, that although we are people who are very invested in the lore and the flavor and of Magic the Gathering, that really our deck building choices are still quite competitive. Like, if we use the outdated somewhat now system of like the number system in EDH, I think almost 90% of all of both of our decks sit in that 6 to 8 range, right? Very few of them are jank fests. Very few of them are 9s or CEDH. I know you've proxied up a CEDH deck, but I don't play CEDH at all. And then I'd say there's maybe a couple that sit around the 5, but very quickly they start getting ramped up. I'm using this number system. I'm aware it's not very accurate, but it just kind of give you an idea of where we sit. And that used to mean that didn't leave a lot of room for overly synergistic, flavorful cards that weren't geared towards, sort of fast wins. Like, there were still a lot of staples in there because you want to play quickly. But I am looking at my decks nowadays, and I'm thinking the ones that I've built recently, like say in the past year and a half, they're far more wholly synergistic and therefore a lot more thematically flavorful, and they're still quite powerful compared to deck lists that I built, say, 4 years ago. Where, say, like my Azuri deck, I've got a list for an Azuri +1/+1 counters deck. That compared to my Kenrith counters deck, which is a newer build, it's almost like night and day compared to the amount of staples versus highly synergistic cards that are in there. And I mean, is that the same for you? Do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I think there are certain decks that I built back in the day, like say Prosh, which is good. It's like my quintessential like battle cruiser deck of where it doesn't play a lot of interaction. It plays all the big haymakers that kind of like typically you'd like see all the time. They don't necessarily have any cross synergy beyond cool Jund graveyard stuff, I guess. But that's like sneezing, when you're playing Gave, like I won through an arbitrary combo, oops. But like you compare that to like say I built a like a Tormod deck which plays all around bringing cards back from the graveyard, but not like a zombie staple kind of deck, but all these like weird cards like Despondency, which is like an enchantment that comes back from the graveyard when the creature that's enchanted to dies, and the idea is you can keep bringing it back whilst enchanting your own creatures and sacrificing them. Or like Vega, I built a Vega deck recently, and a lot of the cards in there feel specific. Like I'm never going to play them in any other deck, right? Like Chronomatic Escape, for example, cards like that are really niche but work very well within that deck. That, I mean, I still think the deck sometimes spins its wheels too hard, but I mean, yeah, it was very. There's so many options, I think, these days, and especially when you look at cards back in the day, that kind of allow for you to have a range on cards that you don't have. Like, you're not forced to play this specific card. Like, you don't have to play Counterspell, you don't have to play Swords to Plowshares, you don't have to play all of the specific cards that typically were being played back in the day, when you can have the same kind of options and potentially have a more powerful flex on it, if you're willing to look a little bit outside the box.
It's interesting that you mentioned things like Swords to Plowshares and things like that, because I think the very genesis of our talking about this recently was the fact that we were looking at our decks and talking about some of like the cool stuff that's come out recently, and the sort of synergies and the flavor, and we can add this in over that and blah 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 blah. And I think both of us kind of realized that one of the key areas of all of our decks that is actually kind of, I'm not going to use the word boring, because that suggests that people who play staples are boring, and that is not true. That's just flat not true. But maybe the kind of cards that tend to be locked in per color is the removal suite. So like all of my decks that have access to black white have a D-Spark in them. All of my red decks had a Chaos Warp in them, until I realized this and I started trying to swap things in and out. And it's just interesting that the removal suite, just for me and you, it seems. And actually, I'd also reached out. I did a bit of like polling on this. I did a bit of a poll on Twitter, and also I checked out. Kristen Gregory has her own Discord now, and on her Discord, I asked the Commander guys there in the Commander chat, like, this very question of, are there any areas that people feel like their decks kind of stagnate a little bit with staples versus synergies? And it was the removal suite. Like, all the people there that said that they had white decks. There was one person who said that they played Swords to Plowshares in every white deck without fail, and they it wasn't necessarily a good thing, but it was just, if you're playing Boros, or if you're playing Selesnya, you don't have that many options, and so you are going to keep it that way. But I think there are lots of options. You just kind of forget, because we have such an influx of cards, right?
Well, yeah, I guess this is an interesting one. I think removal is a perfect example for this. Of aren't all staple cards like really interesting when they're first printed, and then because they're so good and so efficient, like Chaos Warp wasn't made that long ago, and it was like an interesting option that Red didn't normally have access to, and then because now they do. And it was very cool back in the day. Now everyone plays it and everything, but because, again, they haven't printed another option that fulfills that same function, it's very difficult to kind of find an alternative that in your mind like makes sense to put in there. I was thinking of this like a Culling Ritual. Like, Culling Ritual is a new sweeper spell, like 2 black-green. It destroys all non-land permanents that convert mana cost 2 or less, and you add a black or a green for each permanent destroyed this way. Now, that's a really cool effect that hasn't been seen before, and it gives a black another access to a sweeper effect outside of Gaze of Granite or Pernicious Deed. But this card is probably going to be a horrific staple in a few years' time. Everyone will be playing it. Like Oversimplify, for example, was the first like Simic Wrath that we've ever got, and it feels flavorful because the idea is that you squish all of your creatures into this one amalgamation. Because it exiles everything, and each player creates an XX equal to the power of creatures they control or whatever. And it's like cool. That's a really cool effect. We haven't seen that before. But that's going to be played in every single Simic deck going forwards. Ink Shield, for example, really cool, a new crazy fog effect, and it's probably better and more interesting. Doing the whole like, oh, you trying to attack me? Now I'm going to come attack you back for even more. Like again, this is probably going to be a staple in several years' time, and these are all kind of like again, the removal effects are kind of so fit. Like I guess it's interesting to think there are so many little avenues that haven't been explored properly yet. That as soon as they print that effect, it does just become ubiquitous.
Interesting. Well, the one that popped to my mind where I sort of thought, actually, this is something I need to be looking in for specific decks. And again, I'm going to talk about my Kenrith deck. Is it Closing Arguments from Strixhaven? Closing Statement. Sorry, from Strixhaven, which is 3 black-white for an instant spell that reads, this spell costs 2 less to cast for during your end step, hence Closing Statement. We talked about it in our Flavour Picks episode. But the second part of the ability is destroy target creature or planeswalker you don't control. Put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. So in my Kenrith deck, if I'm looking at the Kenrith deck removal suite, I think I've got the same kind of stuff that I usually always run in there. So if I look at my sorceries, I've got Merciless Fiction. Vindicate is one that I play in a lot of decks that have access to black-white instance. Again, D-Spark in the 5-color deck. I'm still putting black-white D-Spark in there. Exactly. I don't play Shock. And then Utter End as well is in there. Really, what I should be doing is I should be taking out Utter End and putting in Closing Statement. Closing Statement has the +1/+1 counter synergy. And this is the kind of thing which I sometimes get annoyed with Commander players specifically, and myself included, because I'm getting annoyed now just looking at my own deck lists, where this kind of rush and this push to have not tuned decks to the point where they're like solved, because that's kind of pushing into like, I think people are kind of fairly restrained when they don't want to make something that's just too oppressive. But these kind of like solved cards, if you like, where we know Utter End is good, we know that Vindicate is good, we know that D-Spark is good, so why would you put something in that could potentially cost 5 mana and only says destroy target creature on it? Whereas the little gains that you get from the other parts of the synergy, and it's flavorfully relevant to your deck as well, I think outweigh the sort of quote unquote inefficiency of the rest of it. And it's just interesting looking at it from a flavors perspective. Why haven't I already put this in my +1/+1 counters deck? Like, all my decks should be aiming for that, I kind of feel, and sometimes they just don't, and it's kind of frustrating, really.
Yeah, do you play that Teamer counter spell that counters a spell and puts 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature you control?
No, I don't. I'll be very honest, counter spells aren't my hugest jam, not because I'm against counter magic, but because I'm actively quite bad at playing them. So I tend to only put 1 or 2 in most of my blue decks, let alone the ones that are like multiple colors. I think I play Negate in quite a few because it's quite flexible, but I always try and get different art for Negate.
That's an interesting one as well, right? Isn't things like counter spells? I guess counter spells for me are like blue removal, right? It's just stack removal.
Oh yeah, for sure.
The same fashion. If answers tend to be less interesting than the questions, right? Like the question's always more interesting than the answer. That might be a more philosophical way to look at it, but it is. But the one, I guess, the idea is that if things like Mortify and Putrefy, right? They're still listed as like some of the best, most played cards in EDH decks. That's probably skewed a lot because a lot of the precons will play them, and so maybe those numbers are inflated slightly. But the more they print similar options, like things like Assassin's Trophy or I can't remember the other top, Abrupt Decay, things like that yes, maybe are still more efficient or more competitive, more likely to be played in CDH. They still have more flavor to them. You're still having to make a decision of do I play the less of the one more expensive broad effect for a Putrefy, or do I go for the more narrow effects? Like, do I want it to be uncounterable? I'm more likely to play against blue spells. I mean, again, here you're not looking at the flavor of the card from a thematic point of view. You're looking at it from a mechanical point of view of where's the hole in my deck? Do I just want this blanket effect, or do I want it to serve this nice specific niche function because this is what my deck's weak against? And maybe that's a conversation that you need to look at. And a lot of the removal, especially in say a set like Strixhaven, all of the removal is really interesting. Things like Fracture, Rip Apart. I mean, yes, they do like blanket effects, but they kind of like maybe that. maybe I'm contradicting myself in the same sentence, because rip apart doesn't necessarily feel flavorful when it can just go, oh, destroy this or destroy this or destroy this. Maybe in the same way fractures just destroy this or destroy this or destroy this. But isn't that still slightly more interesting than, say, utter rain, which just exile anything?
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
know.
It's an interesting one, right? Because you don't just want to make like a deck that doesn't function for all of your decks, right? And obviously some people might just not care. Like as much as, you and I champion this idea that you can play powerful Magic and interactive Magic and you can still push the ceiling on a lot of your decks and keep things flavorful and interesting and sort of surprising even to yourself and all this kind of stuff. That's kind of very high-minded, sort of lofty, self-aggrandizing bullshit, really, when you cut down to it. Like, for a lot of people, they want to have counterspell effect, they put counterspell in their deck. They want a removal effect, they put utter end in their deck. Like, it's no big deal, and it's the attitude that they play with. So, I realize that, 20 minutes into this podcast, we're kind of backtracking a little bit and sort of going, obviously this isn't for everyone. But I sort of feel like there are decks that kind of function in different ways, and the kind of synergy versus staple versus theme versus function thing has a myriad of different combinations. So just before we started recording, I was sort of talking through a couple of my decks to you, and I was sort of thinking that if I was to look at my Bruderclad deck, which I took it apart because I thought it was done. It wasn't because I didn't like playing with it. It was just because, like, when sometimes just a deck just kind of reaches its natural end and you just think, I've lived that life, I want to try something new. So that's where I'm with my Bruderclad deck, but I do, in hindsight, really love it. That was a deck where I prioritized the form of it, right? I really wanted a Bruderclad deck that only produced artifact tokens, and I could copy other things. So I could use like Cackling Counterpart or whatever, quasi duplicate to copy other stuff. But if I was creating tokens straight off the bat, things like Mirrors or Thopters or Golems or whatever else, I just want it to be artifact tokens, because so many other builds had things like Eldrazi and Elementals and whatever, and they're cool in their own way, but that's not what I wanted to do. And so much of what I put into that deck, if I look at the list, it's so synergistic and it's still so on theme that everything kind of came together. And yeah, I was still playing stuff like Stoic Rebuttal, but it just kind of worked in that deck and it really hit all the flavor notes. If I compare that to my Pippa Duchess of Dice deck, which admittedly I don't necessarily want to push the ceiling on too high because it is meant to be kind of a fun knock-around deck. It's silver bordered. You can't make silver bordered decks too powerful because people get, obviously a bit angry about it because they're broken cards. So I've, wanted to keep the ceiling low. But my theme for that is I wanted to do lots of polymorphing and changing the size of other creatures, blowing them up or shrinking them down or polymorphing them into other things. And that's the whole kind of theme of the deck. But honestly, it has all those thematic cards in there, like Giant Growth and like Chaos Wand and all that kind of stuff. It doesn't really function the way that I want it to function. And I find it interesting how two different decks with the same sort of approach of I want to prioritize the theme and kind of stitched togetherness, if you like, of every single one of the cards as much as I possibly can. I'll include staples if they fit, but if not, I won't necessarily put them in. And yet they can end up so different, right? Like, do you find that with any of your builds?
I mean, yeah, I guess there are certain cards that I play that feel more deliberate. In certain, they feel more like they belong in certain decks than they do in others. I guess I'm trying to think, because I try and do. Initially, when I first started trying to do like a spread of decks, I deliberately tried to avoid using the same cards in each deck because it kind of ruins the kind of the individuality of each deck. There are certain cards that I've over the years, I guess I've just kind of, it's when I started buying play sets of things. So I was like, I'll buy a play set of Counterspell. Obviously, but funnily, if we've already talked about this already, but it's the one place I remember buying and thinking, oh, I'm always, whenever I make a blue deck, I'm always going to want to have access to Counterspell. And as I keep going to reach for it, my hand kind of stops halfway and goes, but why though? Like, why do I need? And it's because I haven't bought the different ones. I think they're the white border. I was going to say the one where it looks like the wizard's shocked that his spell hasn't worked, but that's like multiple different counterspell artworks. But it's one of these things where I kind of had to stop a few times. So I'm like, what do I need? Do I need it to be counterspell? And I guess that's kind of like the question, right? If it's what does your deck need to feel that efficiency? Can it get away with being slightly inefficient?
Well, this is it. This is my whole point: is that you can have powerful cards like Bruderclad. I think, to go back to it as my example, is a very powerful commander. I don't think it gets enough love as it sort of deserves, but I don't know a single Bruderclad player out there who doesn't go, whoa, this deck. And obviously, like, from playing against my one, and we've got a couple of others in our play group, like, can go off. And I think if you have decks that have maybe, and obviously more supported synergies, right? Like artifact decks are an archetype as old as the game, right? So, building a red blue artifact deck, you're not going to go too wrong if you pack it full of synergies. I understand that. But if you have a powerful commander, maybe being slightly less efficient with some of your card choices can actually balance the deck a lot better than say just doing the sort of staple deck. Although I have built a couple of those as well, and that is also a theme within itself. Do you know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah, I guess because one of the main things we talked about as well was this idea of commodity, right? Of certain cards feel so like outside of your reach. Like, say for example, something like Sneak Attack was a card that I never expected to own or put into a deck, and then I happened to get hold of one when Modern Masters came around and put it into Rakdos, and it's funny because normally I wouldn't want to play that kind of card because it feels inherently try hard almost. Like I only ever know it used when it's being used for like broken kind of silly combo-y kind of things, instead of being like, well, I guess this is another way to cheat on mana, kind of like Heartless Summoning or Dream Devourer, are all thematically very flavorful for Rakdos. They're ways to cheat my creatures into play by reducing their cost and being kind of cheeky about it. And it doesn't feel like it doesn't feel out of place, but there are certain cards like, say, I happen to have a land tax, and it's one of these cards where I could put it in any of my white decks and it feel right, and yet because I could put it in any of them, it doesn't feel like it should go in any of them. So I just happen to put it in a deck that happens to want to draw a lot of cards. It's in my Bruce and Timner deck because it wants a nice efficient curve, and it is one of my more powerful decks. So I feel like, okay, put maybe the more powerful card into that, and maybe one day I'll come around and make a politics deck, a mono white like politics deck, and then land tax gets moved back into there because that makes sense, right? The idea of like encroaching or growing your land makes more sense to that, whereas certain cards, like I know one of your bugbears, something like Craterhoof Behemoth, like when is that ever going to feel like a flavorful card to put in your deck, to win with? I don't know why Pathbreaker Ibex feels better in Maelstrom Wanderer, but I just love the idea of when he's cascading, this random goat comes out and that's the thing that kills you, compared to a Craterhoof Behemoth. Is that more flavorful? Maybe not. I mean, is it cooler from a mechanical point of view? Because obviously my commander's a 7-power creature. Yeah. Does it thematically feel funnier because I'm chucking a giant goat at you and that's the thing that's killing you? Absolutely. So maybe, again, and maybe it's the expense of something like Craterhoof that it feels like once you have that card and you're playing it, it kind of makes you feel like, oh, maybe I am automatically sacrificing the flavor for the function because I happen to go and buy the expensive card instead of the cheaper option. And at that point, is it a matter of paying to win with certain staples compared to, removal options where it's like you're just not maybe appreciating the other options that are available?
Yeah, maybe. I think part of it is not so much the fact. I think it sort of worked its way back the other way. Do you know what I mean? Like certain cards were very powerful in the format and were the kind of boogeymen of the format. The Kratos Behemoths, the Lab Maniacs, the Cyclonic Rifts. A lot of these cards that if you were to go and look at episodes of the Command Zone podcast with Jimmy and Josh from like say 3 or 4 years ago, there was a finite number of cards that every week they'd be talking about and exploring when the format was
Vidalcan horror.
Yeah, quite. And there are sort of finite number of cards that people. It's not that, again, they're not bored of the cards, but they want to explore other options and they want to be seen to be kind of trying to be creative. And because EDH, as much as you can't claim that every single person who plays EDH is like this incredible genius. I mean, I'm not, for example, but it is the format which allows you to kind of, try new things and flex your own identity a little bit. That's half of the reason people play it. So playing a Pathbreaker Ibex, I think, has a certain cachet to your deck that playing a Craterhoof Behemoth maybe doesn't. Having said that, I was about to say I can't remember the last time I got killed by a Craterhoof Behemoth, but I did just watch a game with our friend Total MTG on Adam the Gathering's Twitch channel because he guested on the stream, and one person did win with a Craterhoof Behemoth. So I have seen it recently. It has happened. I mean, Thassa's Oracle is another example. Like when that came out, that's Lab Maniac. It's the same card.
It's way better.
Well, it's way better, but it functions in the same way. It goes in the same decks. The same with the Jace from
Wielder of Mysteries.
Right? Yeah. Yes, but when people win with those cards, they're all right. People still might eye roll a little bit because of the style of deck that plays it, but people are still far more forgiving of that than they are of seeing Lab Maniac for the 15th time.
Yeah.
It's
No, it's funny
interesting.
because I have a deck that specifically tries to win that way, and that's the Will and Rowan deck. And it was funny because I tried to make a very conscious decision with Strixhaven coming out. I still wanted it to stay as a Will and Rowan partner deck, even though there was a bevy of very cool Prismari options that came out with the set. Obviously, it helped that the set had a lot of Will and Rowan themed cards, and I was going to take out Jace, and I was going to take out Lab Maniac because. And maybe I don't even think I play Lab Maniac anymore. I'll have to quickly check as I'm talking. I'm going to load up the deck. But I was going to take out those because I was like, well, maybe I don't want to win that way anymore. And like, things like Crackle of Power or a culmination of studies. I was like, those are two different ways that I can win by doubling my X spells. I don't have to, do the whole draw my deck to win kind of thing. And I kind of moved Wizards out. And I was like, if I'm moving Wizards out, then it makes sense to move the Lab Man out, right? Like, because I don't need it because I'm not likely to be looking. Yeah, it's not in the deck anymore. But do I still have Jace World of Mysteries in there? Yes, because it's a Planeswalker deck. So thematically, it feels like it's a lot harder to maybe resolve and keep Jace in play. And the Lab Mate didn't need to be in there because now I've got other flavorful ways to win, like the culmination of the end of the Strixhaven story of where Rowan, goes crazy and has a Crackle with Power moment, and then the moment where they work together in the culmination of studies is the way that they win in the story. I'm like, well, that's the way I want to win my games, Like Jace Wheel of Mysteries, as much as he has an ultimate that wins you the game, or like, well, technically static, is the one that wins you the game. It didn't actually do that in the story to win the day, realistically. So it kind of feels like a flavor dud. And again, like taking out Labman didn't feel bad, and I don't play Thassa's Oracle in the deck either because it doesn't feel flavor. It feels done, right? It feels like almost like a staple way to win, which is a very interesting thing. And as much as Burn back in the day, I mean, actually, Burn historically has never been a typical way to win an EDH, and now that you can, it feels much more interesting and thematic to burn someone out than it does to go, oh, you do whatever you want. I'm just going to sit here and draw my entire library and I'll win, and there's nothing much you can do about it.
Yeah, it's interesting talking about sort of the done quote unquote ways to win, because obviously there are tried and true methods. I find there is a certain, and it's not necessarily a thematic sort of flavor to it or a thematic aesthetic, but there is almost sort of like a meta aesthetic to decks that have these kind of packed in staple wins, if you like. And this is kind of where I think the sort of staple aspect can be almost flavorful, like as opposed to the synergies. So I'm talking about, if we look at my decks, my Xyrus deck, the Writhing Storm. So Xyrus the Writhing Storm is essentially, it's a wheels deck, right? So it's very similar to things like the Locust God and Akusa or anything. Sort of sits in that little wheelhouse, literally, of decks. Obviously, it has access to green, which the others don't, so you can kind of do some other bits and bobs. And that deck, I've almost gone out of my way to make that, like, to try and really hit the high ceiling as far as casual builds of that deck can go, and put in as many classic EDH win cons as I can in the deck that still obviously function to a certain degree. As I suppose we put a caveat again halfway through the episode, when we say, synergies versus staples, there is the assumption that if you're a half decent deck builder, most of the cards will serve some sort of synergy, but there are obviously just individual cards that, fill roles within the deck. So, for example, my Xyrus deck, if I just kind of run through some of the kind of all-star EDH, cards that are in here, I've got things like Beastmaster Ascension and Shared Animosity for tokens, because Xyrus creates a lot of snakes. I've got Doubling Season in there, which again is another like double upper thing. I've got things like Impact Tremors and Perforos, which is obviously a classic way to utilize tokens. So I'm getting like Hornets and Snakes off of Xyrus and the Locust God. But then I have things like Psychosis Crawler for like the wheel effects and stuff like that, and the two Niv-Mizzets that ping people when people draw cards, when I draw cards. So it's just trying to pack as much stuff in there as possible to utilize these powerful cards, and it's a fairly powerful deck because I have a lot of different outs that I can utilize. It gets balanced out slightly because I need Xyrus or the Locust God to kind of really make the deck function with all the win cons. So maybe it's a little bit win con heavy. I don't know, people can sort of tell me once they sort of look at the deck list. But I like that about the deck. Like, there's a Cyclonic Rift in there. I like the fact that I've got a Cyclonic Rift in that deck because it kind of works out. I haven't found a place for Vidalcan Ori yet. Another part of this conversation being kicked up is I told you that I had a box of builds that I was trying to put into my Prismari deck when I was building it, and Vidalcan Ori and Sensei's Divining Top. I just kind of sat in a bits box with my. I've only got one copy of each. I can't find a home for them since I tore down Broodaclad, which is mental because they're like super powerful like EDH cards.
Well, this is I guess one of the things that we raised a point of is that sometimes you look at a card that's unique, like specifically powerful, and you go, Well, because I guess maybe this is inherent of like our build style of where we feel a pull towards certain cards thematically, regardless of whether or not they are staples or sleepers. You know, like there's nothing better than playing a card and have everyone at the table go, "What does that do?"
Yeah.
You know, but I mean, there are some certain cards like that you look at, you go, "I don't even know where to put you because all you are is strong." And
Yeah.
there are, and funnily enough, I've got enough strong options in all my decks that you don't necessarily replace anything like if you don't replace anything automatically, right? You're not like a strict upgrade to anything. You're just a powerful card that where do I want to put you? Because I have a Sinner deck, like I have a Tassica lands deck. Yeah, I know, super original. But it plays the same kind of thing of where it has Cyclonic Rift, it has Scape Shift, it has Crucible of Worlds, it has Splendid Reclamation, it has Seaborn Muse, it has Azusa Lost, but see, it has every possible. Oh yeah, that's a good lands card, except for things like Burgeoning or what's the other one that's Exploration. It doesn't play like cards like that. But I mean, I've got Snapcaster Mage in there, like I've got Gitrog, I've got it's just the tick the box of, oh yeah, of course, your typical tryhard. But as a deck, like I still think thematically it works very well because it's it feels like the villain deck of where you play all the nonsense cards and it's like, you can't interact with my lands, that kind of thing. But yeah, it is sometimes a matter of like, where do you put this card that doesn't have the flavor kind of to tell you where to move it? And I guess sometimes these cards do just find a home when you're randomly brewing. Like one of the things that we've done in our little play group a lot recently has kind of come up with budget builds. I do random budget builds. So this is where my Tormod and Tevesh deck came from, of like build like I think it was under 50 pounds or like under 25 pounds. So I was like, well, cool, I can just play all of the random like recursion effects. And then when I slowly built it up, it's the first deck that I've ever owned that has both Damnation and Toxic Deluge in it. And it feels a little bit naughty because it was a cheeky little budget deck. And now it's playing things like Oversold Cemetery and Oath of Graves, I think it is, or something. Like all these crazy cards I saw back in the day that I'm like, oh, that's just super powerful graveyard stuff. But it feels okay because it was had at home in like as a little budget recursion deck, so it doesn't feel too bad. It doesn't feel as try hard as me putting All His Dust and Dig Through Time and Toxic Deluge into a Tassica deck, because that's dicky. Or winning with Toxic Deluge for like the Torment of Hellfire for the 18th time in a row. I know, but again, got to be the villain, and maybe that is the theme, right? Of sometimes, I guess, again, full circle, when you come around to either the cards becoming such a commodity or being outclassed by so many other options that are slightly more nuanced, that aren't necessarily worse, that you come back round to those staples and you go, oh, hello, old friend. Hello, Vindicate. Oh, it's been a while, hasn't it? I haven't put you in a deck since, they made Anguished Unmaking. And it kind of becomes the anti-staple, because it used to be the staple, but now, like, the other cards are staples. So maybe that then feels good. Like, if you're playing in like an old school deck, get an old school board of Vindicate. That's way better than having Anguished Unmaking. Like, I'd respect that way more. So again, maybe it's come full circle.
Maybe that is the full circle. Maybe you're right. I'm sort of thinking, like, this whole episode is really us just thinking out loud. In our very first episode, we spoke about what is flavor, and that was literally the title of the episode and the kind of stuff that we packed in there. And I think we spoke in that episode. We tried to lay out what we wanted to do with this podcast, and obviously, over 70 odd episodes, things have come to pass, things haven't. But one of the things we spoke about was the function of cards and how they make you feel, as well as like the pretty pictures or the story behind it, whatever. And if we just really rip it down to like, is flavor how something makes you feel? And I think that was something big that we landed on that first episode. If a staple makes you feel good when you're playing it, like you've earned that win, or that Cyclonic Rift made you feel powerful, or that counterspell hit right at the mark, or the creative behemoth came at the last second and pumped up all your little 1/1s and you went ham with it, then I guess there really isn't a problem with having staples in your deck. I think that's kind of how we're saying it without saying it. Like, I think we would like to prefer to play synergy and sort of thematic cards over staples, and staples are maybe a little bit done because you see them a lot or whatever. But really, when you think about it, if the person playing it, if they feel that it's good in their deck and it makes them happy playing it, then I guess it does work for the theme of the deck. The problem is when someone does something and they go, oh yeah, no, I won that way. You're like, yeah, you did, but why? If in this format, if you didn't like it, why are you
change
doing
it.
it? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Like, I don't think you can blame yourself for necessarily putting those cards in or eventually finding it in the deck, right? Sometimes you don't consciously do it. If you find yourself starting like, okay, this colour combination, and you start with this 30 cards, and then because you've also got your land base there, it's already 65% of your deck already done. Like, maybe that's the problem, right? But the other thing that we haven't really mentioned at all is that between like mystical archives and secret layers and alternate art versions, like, there's not just one version of Cultivate. You can play
No.
very different types of cultivates that all, yes, okay, it does the thing and it serves the function. No one's going to blame you for playing the card that serves the function, but maybe if you go for like, oh, I went for the Mystical Archive or I went for the Japanese artwork one, which obviously that's its own controversy anyway, but like, it depends on which one you go for sometimes. I guess certain ones don't necessarily have an option for you. And if you are just playing it because you need that efficiency and you need that effect in your deck and nothing else does it, Chaos Warp is a prime example. Like certain decks, Chaos Warp works very flavorfully. If you're playing like a Cascade deck, or if you're playing a I was gonna say I guess a Chaos deck, where you
Well,
have
no,
lots
yeah,
of like
literally a Chaos
random
deck
effects.
or a deck
Literally,
that, like, if my Pippa deck had access to red, for example, Chaos War would be going in there, no problem.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly. So, like, even a polymorphy kind of deck, like, it does have flavor for it. I guess it just depends on how you justify it. And even with things like, I say, Secret Layers are a really good example of how you can really flex kind of towards a certain theme if you're willing to, pay a little bit more to have that slightly more efficient thing. And then maybe if you're not going to do that, that's absolutely fine. And maybe then you want to go for something that mechanically is a little bit more flavorful. It's just, I guess the tough thing is EDH Rec kind of just shows these cards at the top. And maybe if that's where you're looking, then you don't see much past that. What I find very interesting is that the latest precons had very nuanced cards. There are very few staple effects in there. There are a lot of cards that I was like, oh, this works so well in here. I didn't expect them to put it in here because it's maybe more on the expensive side, or maybe it's a little bit older, or something that's a little bit more niche. They could have done something that was much more simply powerful. But the nuance within these decks was really interesting. And then in the new cards they printed, as much as they might become quote unquote staples, they have a very cool flavor to them, and they have a very nice, efficient, or not even necessarily efficient effect, but a nuanced effect that we haven't seen before. And I don't think that's a bad thing if you suddenly have a new sweeper that goes, oh, but like, say for example, Doomscar. Like, Doomscar is a really good example of like, okay, yeah, it's just a Wrath. It's like, yeah, but it's got like quite a cool amount of flavor to it, and it only costs 3 mana. A 3 mana Wrath's really interesting. Like a lot of these, like the Devastating Mastery, I used that recently, of where, okay, cool, it allows someone to bounce something back to their hand, but I mean, there's almost like it adds an element of politics over the top of where you need to like shake my hand to shake your hand. Like the Demonstrate cards, for example, like they do very obvious, simple effects that aren't necessarily super flavorful, but the fact you get your opponent to engage with them, it kind of creates a different theme on the card of where you
Yeah,
want to
there
open the
are
option out to the table a bit more.
the refrain cards from the Prismari precon, the refrain of inspiration and refrain of ooh, there we go. There's me forgetting what's in my
Oh,
own
don't.
deck. We shouted about these cards like all the time when they first came out as well. That's so silly for
Yeah, I
us.
know. Like, mate, there were 15 new cards that were released today that are now in my brain space. I can't remember every word in Magic. That's madness.
Rousing refrain and
Rousing, that's it,
inspiring
yeah.
refrain. The fact that they're suspend is a very well known and very powerful mechanic, but yeah, because they use them in interesting ways, then they can fit in new decks. It's funny that you mentioned about the Mystical Archives, because I'm literally looking at Krosan Grip. Krosan Grip is one of my big wins for like the Mystical Archive cards. Specifically, we're talking about Mystical Archives, but really this is just the big push from Wizards of the Coast to use things like, like the Secret Layers, when distribution models aside, things like the Secret Layers, the showcase cards, the Mystical Archives, all these like different ancillary products where they're printing like promo art and stuff on them to give staples of the format, because they know that a lot of these cards are used in EDH, new life. So if you look at Krosan Grip, for example, I'm looking at it on Scryfall, there's like 24 printings of this card, and right up until the Mystical Archive, you had the classic Krosan Grip artwork by Zoltan Boris and Gabor Ziskai, and then you had a promo artwork by Franz von Winkle, which was only on Go and an FNM promo, but that's like way back in the day. I'll say way back in the day, like 2010. But now with the Mystical Archive and the Japanese Mystical Archive, we now have 4 different printings. We literally doubled the amount of flavor. And I'm thinking specifically like using this card. If I've got my werewolf deck coming at the end of the year, and it will come at the end of the year, I want to use Krosan Grip because it's a good role player. It's a staple card. And honestly, there are a few other green removal spells that would fit the flavor of a werewolf deck. Now, the original Krosan Grip artwork by Boros and Ziskai wouldn't really necessarily fit it. Like you could kind of go, well, it's kind of generic nature and it's
Yeah.
destroying the sword or whatever. But what,
Isn't that artwork the staple at that point?
yeah, yeah,
You know what I mean? If
exactly.
you see it and you go, oh, okay, cool, yeah, that card. And when cards don't get like a new lease of life, I feel like you don't then get the option of diversity, right? Because it's
Yeah,
funny because you said about it, Crows Grip being like the staple, like spell. And I'm like, it's funny over the last like few years recently, I've specifically changed all of the Crows and Grips, or at least I've put Nature's Claim into like so many decks without even
sure.
thinking. It's almost like a personal stapling
Mm,
of where I've gone, oh yeah, automatically put the 1 mana spell in because I happened to find a bunch of them, realize how strong it was to have. I don't care if you have 4 life here, like destroy your
mm,
thing, and like now it's almost like I looked at Crows and Grip and went, actually, that's so much better.
yeah,
And why aren't I playing it and everything? And in my spike brain, and this is maybe another question of maybe different psychographics kind of go more for staples versus the synergies. Like maybe the Vorthos or the Johnny is more likely to play the slightly off kilter kind of card, whereas the Spike and the Timmy might just be like, yeah, cool, good card.
yeah.
Like maybe that's where that lies. But I even noticed in myself of like, yeah, I've Nature's Claim stapled myself recently, like, and maybe I need to diversify where I look for my removal
Or
spells a little
maybe
bit more.
like yeah, or maybe you just hope that they do another printing because to kind of like cap off my thought about the Croson Grip, the Mystical
Yeah,
Archive version by Mintu Hinien, which is just the English Mystical Archive or the non-Japanese one, I should say. The artwork on that just feels more like to me what I would find in a werewolf deck because it's kind of a storybooky illustration style. It's got a druid on there where he's got like antlers, and that kind of is a bit evocative to me to sort of the cult of the waxing moon card from Shadows over Innistrad. And it's just even though it's not werewolf themed and it's not even set on Innistrad, it just feels like it would fit in that deck better. So having all these different artworks and these different versions of staple cards. Like, imagine what they could do. I mean, they did a box topper version of Cyclonic Rift, didn't they? But it was still fairly Izzety. Imagine if they did a Cyclonic Rift, which was set on a Courier or something, and it was like a big maelstrom in like the sea or something like that.
yeah. I was thinking Ixalan when you said that as
Yeah,
well.
or
Yeah,
Ixalan, exactly. Like, I
yeah.
think people would maybe be a lot more forgiving of that. I mean, maybe they wouldn't, but maybe people putting it into decks would be far more forgiving of themselves. Like I have 2 copies of Cyclonic Rift. One of them is in my Xyrus deck, as we've discussed. That's the basic bitch deck of just EDH like win cons. But the other copy is in Zephi, Thunder Conductor, because it's a removal spell that is obviously very good and a staple, but it is literally a storm on the card. And Zephi is the Thunder
Mm,
Conductor. And so I could put it in that deck without necessarily feeling like a total scumbag because it was like, well, it fits the theme of the deck. I feel good when I play it. So
mm.
yeah, I don't
Does
know.
that go against us when we said about we don't understand why they did the Mystical Archive for random staples as a secret lair?
No,
Okay,
because
good. Digging the holes in. All
no,
right,
no,
good.
because that was them. That was just them making an extra product out of a style that they've already used. Like you could have just put
Mm.
those cards in the actual set. No, they could have
That, that
done.
that was yeah, that was it. That was a good point. Yeah, because they could have just put those cards in the set. Yes, yes, exactly. That was the point. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, yes.
Are there any of your decks you think, if you were to think about your own sort of, I mean, your library of EDH decks is triple mine, but is there any of your decks that you feel like you've really hit a good level of cards that synergize really well with the deck, that keep the theme, but are just like you couldn't imagine putting staples in there because you don't think they would necessarily even do better than what you put in there?
I guess.
Do you know what I mean?
My initial, yeah, because my initial take was going to be yes, Bruce and Timner, and then I've just realised the top card out of my instance is a Chromus Will, and the top card in my enchantments is Land Tax. I'm like, oh, I guess maybe not. Oh
Shall I tell you
man, I
mine?
think yes.
What do you think?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go.
So
Let me have a little look
my
through.
one is my Atris Oracle of Half Truths deck, and I've spoken about this deck quite a lot on this podcast because it's
Hmm.
genuinely it's out of the last sort of 3 or 4 decks that I've built. This is the one where I think like I've really hit the sweet spot of what I want, not just from this deck, but from all of my EDH decks. If I had to pick like one sort of build style, and the whole theme of this deck is that Atris obviously is a fact or fiction. Well, he's sorry, he's a Fortune's Favor on a stick. So he's put 2 piles, one face up, one face down. You pick a pile to put into your hand. So he's like someone else makes the piles and kind of tricks you into picking what they want you to pick. So the whole deck is built around choices and decisions and hidden information and all this kind of thing. And I try to pack as much of that into the deck as possible. So I have removal in there. That's things like Raven Form from Kaldheim, where it's the foretell card. So it goes away, and then you don't know when it's going to happen. Or you've got like Truth or Tale or Fact or Fiction, Fortune's Favour, all of these kind of pick and choose cards. I even have things like Primordial Mist, which manifests things off the top of your library face down, so people don't know what you're doing, but you can see and play them at any time. It has things like ninjas, like Yuriko, Tiger's Shadow, and Sakishima's Student. So you attack in with one creature, and then you put another one in because people don't know quite what you're attacking with, and all these different kind of ideas. And it's got a few flicker elements in there as well to kind of keep it functionally still relevant. So it's got Grey Merchant Asphodel because Atris isn't into the battlefield ability and all this kind of thing. And just each one of these cards, I can look at it and think, although thematically, like it's not an Orzhov deck where all the cards are from Ravnica, or it's not a Weatherlight deck where it's all the crew of the Weatherlight. They're very disparate looking cards on paper. But when you actually start looking at what they're doing and how they function, and like, yeah, I could put like a rapid hybridization in. Yes, I could put a counterspell rather than split decision. But they wouldn't work as well for the whole deck as a set of 100 cards than what I put in there. And I don't even think they would necessarily make the game smoother, because things like Fact or Fiction effects are really powerful draw spells. Like if I just put in a Ponder or a Brainstorm or a Preordain, like I have done in other blue decks, even though they're cheaper and quote unquote more efficient, they wouldn't actually make me win more games. But I'm able to win the games that I do with the cards that I put in there whilst keeping the sort of thematic structure of the deck. Like, does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's funny because as soon as you said Atris, I was like, oh yeah, actually, to be fair, I did go Flavour over Function and Scarab God.
Yeah.
But to avoid training the same ground, because I play like a lot of the like our decks obviously have some degree of overlap because I play Atris in the deck as well, and I do like this idea of anything. The name of the deck is anything you can do, I can do better, and it literally just has every single possible way that I'm like of stealing or replicating like other people's things. Like I play Thada Adele so I can sneak in and steal people's soul rings. You know, I play Twin Cast to counter spell. So it's like I'm not countering your spell. I'm copying your counter spell and countering your spell with your counter spell. Or Narset's reversal of like, okay, well I bounce that spell and I'm going to steal your effect and I'm going to get to use it instead. That kind of idea. And the other deck that I had that kind of wanted to do that moved away from like typical staples was Maelstrom Wanderer. And it's interesting that recently I bought the Commander Collection Green and I put in the Worldly Tutor in the Sylvan Library because I didn't have enough anywhere better to put them, and I was like, well, that's top of the deck manipulation, right? And funnily enough, it feels weird when I have those cards in hand. I'm like, well, that doesn't feel like what this deck was supposed to be doing. It was supposed to be like when I first built it, I just kind of wanted to throw together the best possible way to make a Nathan version of that deck. I know that's really self-serving, but I could have gone with like a typical Cascade route. You know, I could have just done I've seen a fair few decks recently where I'm like, cool, I can kind of like maybe like playing things like Sunbird's Invocation. Like I don't play Sunbird's Invocation in there. I wanted to kind of make it my own flavor, and recently I've kind of betrayed that by putting in these kind of staple cards. Whereas I feel like Scarab God's in one deck that I've been like, no, I'm gonna keep being me, and I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna make every time I find like a new interesting way to do it. Like say Aura Thief is annoyingly expensive. When it dies, you steal all enchantments on the battlefield. I'm like, oh, that's so cool, and no one really plays it outside of like douchey old school decks. So like, that'd be really cool, but it's expensive. So that's kind of like maybe the opposite of a commodity card that feels really flavorful for the deck that I can't necessarily get to. But when I do get it, it feels even better because it's a commodity that is flavorful and it fits the deck nicely instead of stupid sneak attack, which I feel really bad for every time I play it because it's really good and it slaps, you know. So it's funny that we both went Dimir because I guess it also depends on what the theme of the deck is. Like some themes typically have greater staples in them, right? Like Anointed Procession and Doubling Season for token decks. Like you don't necessarily have other options for that. There are certain themes that kind of just play better with, say, a Divine Visitation. You kind of want to put in most of your white token making decks, and if you're not, you're maybe not playing optimally, and there isn't unfortunately a suboptimal flavorful option that kind of takes its place. So I guess it depends on what deck you're going for now, and the more support they give each individual mechanic and each individual color pairing, especially with something like Strixhaven where it expands what guilds can do into like colleges, that's maybe where, and this maybe is a really interesting time to talk about it because we are almost like rewriting the history book of what certain colors can do and the stable effects for it. Like I don't necessarily know if Osgir decks need a Boris Charm. Like they probably do, like they probably would benefit from it, but I don't think it's an automatic inclusion when you're upgrading the deck to put it in there. So maybe it's just a design philosophy thing recently of where they kind of create these nice diverse effects that can fulfill the individual role without feeling like you have to replace it with that old card that's better.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this idea of kind of rejigging the colors is going to pay off in the long run. I think thematically as well as sort of diversifying the staple pool, if you like. Because if you look at a card like Smothering Tithe, right, which is the
Yeah.
staple white ramp, if you like, ramp card, 4 cost enchantment gets you treasures when everyone else, draws a card. They've obviously that was like their kind of prototype to see where they could push white, and they've made other cards that are doing things. Was it Monologue Tax that they put in one of the Strixhaven
Yeah.
precons? That's a very similar thing, and you can tell
Hmm.
that this kind of way of getting white to ramp is where they're looking to push. Right? Obviously, Smothering Tithe is still objectively the best because that was, I think, the furthest they could push it. But
Mm.
I think we will start seeing that because this is a staple white card now. In a couple of years' time, it might not be so because there might be other things going on. I have 2 copies of Smothering Tithe. One of them is in my Call of the Ghost Council deck because it's an Orzhov card, and I like the idea of having the treasure tokens from Guilds of Ravnica and Ravnica Allegiance, which are the Orzhov coins on the treasure. So that is literally a
Mm.
thematic reason, as well as it being a very powerful card. But it's also my Queen Chesa deck, which is a 3-color Mardu deck, where I'm like, well, it'd be silly not to put it in there, really. So
Yeah.
that is a more
Yeah.
stable decision, right?
Absolutely. That's why it's in my Timber and Tower. It's like, well, I
Yeah,
can't not play it. It better go in my good deck, you know.
yeah. So I wonder. I think we're in an interesting time. Just we don't have much time left, and I'm kind of aware that this is a very unstructured episode. Do you think, just as kind of cap off question, do you think that the kind of boogeyman of staples is really as prevalent in the playgroups, that at least the playgroups that we play in, but obviously we've been playing with a lot more other people as well because of things like Spell Table, and creating content offers you a lot of chances to play with interesting people you wouldn't necessarily get to play with in your own play group as well. Do you think staples are as prevalent in the format as they were maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
God, no. I think the only prevalent staples that I don't think you'll ever be able to avoid are Mana Rocks and Ramp.
Mm.
Everything else has been diversified enough now that you have flavor options in every direction, and you're not necessarily always going to see the same, especially considering that answers tend to tend to change with the metagame anyway. If you are doing that kind of thing of where your metagame is going to diversify, or if it's going to go towards a certain direction, if you're the kind of person that changes your decks kind of week by week depending on what other people are playing, then I don't think your decks ever kind of sit on a staple thing anyway. But I feel like something like Soul Ring or Arcane Signet, it's very hard to print things that it's hard to print better options or like parallel options because there isn't a lot of flavor to be diversified there. But those aren't really the cards that do things in your decks, right? Those are just the ways that your deck works. Mana is just an unfortunate necessity in the deck. I know that Hearthstone got away with not having it, but we have to have lands, we have to have mana kind of to make our game work. So I feel like that doesn't matter. Whereas with every other aspect, the threats, I feel like the creature diversity is so good these days that it doesn't matter like which one you go for. It's never like an empirically wrong answer. Same with card draw. I think even counter spells, I think removal, and this is where our conversation started of where we say, oh, is removal kind of the staples that are hard to avoid being the same ones in every deck? Like apart from a card like say Chaos Warp, which is very specific and very irreplaceable currently in the game, I can very easily see having a couple of other analogs in say 2 or 3 years time.
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm willing to agree with you there for all those reasons, and I would add also that I kind of feel like the kind of, as you said at the top of the episode, the kind of breathe in, breathe out with card design also lends itself to players as well. I know this is obviously you can't talk for all players because there's thousands of people across the world that play Magic, and there are thousands of people who play Commander specifically as well. But I sort of feel, at least from my experience in our play group and sort of playing with other people, like sort of once or twice from very different play groups, the majority of what I'm seeing and on things like social and Discord is that people want to be able to flex outside of the EDH Rec top 100, right? And they're not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily doing it to like kind of, belittle other people's build styles or whatever. It is very much like they just want to test their own decks. A lot of people, especially if they've been playing the game for a couple of years, like not so much maybe slightly newer players because they're going through this process. But if players have played for a couple of years, they've probably built all the decks, or they've played a lot of the cards which are the kind of EDH Rec top 100, or they've played against them. And so I think the more popular the format becomes, the more like players become sort of more enfranchised. The bigger the sort of like sort of 2+ year player base of EDH players grows, I think the more and more we're going to start seeing that staples as a kind of breed certainly become a lot less prevalent, and I think that's a good
I th-
thing. Yeah.
yeah, I feel like it's kind of becoming an obsolete terminology because players either now look older for like or look past like say this. I like to say, think of it like a 5-year threshold, right? Of where
Mm.
those are the cards that were played a lot in the early stages of EDH, where people didn't necessarily know about the older sets or look into them, and we're getting lots of reprints and throwbacks and stuff, and ways to access older sets are much more easy with things like Scryfall. Or you have the current quote unquote dilemma of where so many new cards are influxing that it's very easy to overlook going and look like from 2 sets ago and go, oh shit, I didn't realize that was a card that was printed, how did I miss that? And then you suddenly it's a because there's so much new product, it's almost like the new cards that should be staples and should take place are coming so thick and fast that you don't have time to really notice them. So it feels like we're kind of that little bubble, like that 5-year to 10-year ago kind of bubble of staples is slowly, I think the in reality the bubble burst on it already. It's just that the numbers don't necessarily translate immediately to something like EDH Rec. I think it's much more likely that, say, Archaeomancer's Map's a card that should be played in every white deck, to the point of where you'll probably see, Smothering Tithe eventually become obsolete as the price climbs and the accessibility to it is less affordable and less realistic, and it becomes that commodity card of where it's no longer a staple because you can't get hold of it as easily. So you play the other alternatives, and maybe those are technically more staple than other cards because of their accessibility. You watch Archaeomancer's Map be about $35 in a couple of years, and people not be able to play it because it's harder to get hold of. Like, yeah, and I feel like it depends as well. When they start doing like these Lord of the Rings sets and Warhammer sets, will people gravitate away from them deliberately because the flavor of the card doesn't fit the deck? So, or do they print a card that's so good that then it becomes much more noticeable as a staple because it stands out because its flavor is so different to the rest of your deck? Like, I guess some staples get away with it because they don't have any flavor. If you don't notice it being like against the grain of the rest of the deck, it doesn't feel like it's wrong because they're so innocuous in their flavor. Like, who knows? Yeah, I think again, maybe it's an obsolete terminology these days. Maybe we're behind in the times. Maybe like EDH Rec is behind in the times. Catch up, buddy.
Maybe this entire episode is just completely pointless, and we've just wasted an hour of your life.
Well, yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting thought process, though, right?
Yeah.
Like, yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, and
this is what we've been chatting about, and it was just I think it was just worth pressing the record button and sort of seeing what was happening. I think throughout this episode, I don't know if you've noticed, I've been very careful as to whether to say things are good or bad or objectively boring or objectively exciting. A couple of episodes I was talking about fetch lands, and I went, "Oh, I've never been caught out by a fetch land," and multiple people in our play group messaged me directly and was like, "What the
yeah.
fuck are you talking about? You've lost my
Oh
Windgrace deck
man,
plenty of
it's
times."
so funny. It's so funny that you had your own little meta commentary that was going on around you after
Yeah,
saying
like I got shouted at
that.
from all directions, and I was like, "All right, all right." I didn't expect to be called out on it. Jesus Christ!
Yeah,
I sit in
yeah.
my room with a microphone in front of me. I can say whatever the fuck I like. I don't expect it to have repercussions.
That's true. That's true. I guess one thing we haven't really said is that it's funny that most of the staples tend to be the cards that like do something by themselves rather than the cards that other cards work through, right? So I guess at that point it just depends on whether you're building your decks to serve functions or to go through a process, and that's a whole different conversation for another time.
It is indeed. Well, there we go. I think we've philosophized on this rather enough. I mean, this is the kind of thing that you could do an entire podcast series on, really. And indeed, it does form the basis of a lot of content that's out there. I think it's just we focus so much because thankfully we actually have it nowadays. We focus quite a lot on the narrative of the cards, which is something that we set out to do. And sometimes I think we forget to look at the other things, which is just simply how do the cards function and what does that mean for the game that we play? Because we are first and foremost Magic players. I think we forget that even ourselves. So yeah, I think it was a question worth answering, or at least waffling around. All right, guys. Well, let us know what you feel about the Synergies versus Staples debate. You can let us know on our Twitter at mtflavouring. You can email us mtflavouring@gmail.com. My personal Twitter is at AndyManface. Nathan's, yours is
At the Fox in the Moon.
And yeah, check out our YouTube channel as well. Like, we've thrown up the Christian Gregory interview that we did a video for that, so that is now on our YouTube. And yeah, do all the kind of podcasty things, like hit the 5 stars and leave a cool comment and say how great we are and that you love us talking nonsense for an hour into your ear holes. That's literally what we've just done here. Other than that, Nathan, do you have any final words?
No, I guess technically speaking, we're kind of back in spoiler season. Squirrels. Other than that, no, that's what I've got to say.
People love a squirrel. I've noticed.
Fucking
this.
who doesn't love a squirrel? Who doesn't love a squirrel? I don't even play squirrels. I've never played squirrels, and somehow I'm still delighted every time they print new squirrel cards. It's like an ingrained human character. I don't know. There's something about them. The squirrels, right?
My final thought is that I hope that the end of May signals the end of the literal month-long rainy season we've had in the UK, because it has been unbearable.
Oh man, what happened to summer? Jeez.
Well,
Jeez.
spring.
This time last year.
We didn't have spring. We didn't have spring. Where did it go?
Actually, that's a good point. I think the magnolia outside my house, it bloomed for like 3 days, and then there was a cold snap, frost on the ground, all the petals fell off, and I was like, well, I guess that's spring and summer gone back into winter. Great. Fantastic.
Your
Unbelievable.
Poor magnolia. We'll pour one out for your magnolia. All right, well, on Nathan's wilting magnolia, we will leave it there. All that remains for me to say, guys, is thank you so much for listening. This has been Magic Flavouring.
We'll see you soon.